We're about to make a move from one panel to another. So as one departs the stage, others, Michael, who is going to convene our final panel for our session this morning. Let me just say that we are being joined throughout this morning's session online. People are connecting to the live streaming of this. And just to remind people who have come in now, we began the session with obviously Lynn providing an overview, the key findings and the key recommendations, and obviously a deep dive into 3 or 4 of our major contributing jurisdictions. We then have had a panel, and I'm speaking to colleagues that have joined us, we then had a panel that actually focused on comprehensive services, on finance and governance, and then an opportunity now in this panel just completed to pick up on pedagogy and workforce. In this final panel, and Michael, you're going to take us home, we're going to be focusing on data that's going to drive improvement. And with that, we now are fully wired and amplified.
I was sitting on the mic. Please, when the articles are written about this convening, microphone should not be part of it. All of you who have, with good humor, followed this online, thank you for joining us. I'm going to just welcome this wonderful panel. We have Craig Rice from Montgomery County. Really, really wonderful to see you here. You all have met Nirmala, and you have met Kathy, and I want to introduce Jacqueline Jones, who's the president of the Foundation for Child Development. She's joining us. No, something's going on with the noise. Are you guys okay? So for those of you in the room, you have the cheat sheet of some of the main takeaways on this not as yet trending topic, Rebecca Gomez, data to drive program improvement. And I want to do a shout out to Caridad, who raised this as her favorite topic. So perhaps we can get audience participation from her in a moment. Just really quickly, these were my 6 takeaways from chapter 6 and from the comparative case analyses that you all are growing more familiar with. Number 1, the study or the studies distinguish between data collection for what Lynn and colleagues refer to as status facts, that is for program monitoring, and research, which is research typically empirically designed and implemented studies. All the program monitoring approaches place great emphasis on program improvement as opposed to program closure or program sanctions. All the countries have an infrastructure that supports program data collection and use, including, and this is something we haven't heard too much about, which I'm interested in getting into, including the development of technological systems and inspector professional development. I know that Montgomery County has done some really interesting pioneering work on the use of data and uses of technology. I'd say most of the countries are moving to align program monitoring across all setting types, often guided by national frameworks. We'll hear a little bit about England's pioneering work in this respect, as well as Hong Kong's. And to varying degrees, all the study countries make some amount of program monitoring data available to the public. There's a lot we can learn here in the US about that. And then 2 final points. 1, all countries have prioritized the translation of research into policy and practice. This is something that the Foundation for Child Development is doing quite a lot of, and we'll be hearing from Jackie Jones about the US context in that respect. And then I'd say the countries do not generally engage in large-scale, aggregated, formal outcome assessments for young children. England is a notable exception in this regard, and I think that Kathy will be able to comment on the UK's foundation profile, which he's already mentioned. So I'm going to start off with a question for Nirmala and Kathy. What parts of the data improvement mix that you have just tell us about what you have in place in the UK and in HK. And Kathy, if you can refer to in your answer your mixed system of childcare data collection and program monitoring, that would be super helpful. So why don't you start, Nirmala, and then follow up.
Will we start with program monitoring?
Right.
Okay. We have a national inspection service that inspects, as I said, primary schools, secondary schools, and even universities. So we didn't have to set up a new agency. We already had one, highly respected. And it has a one-day inspection, it's public, and naturally it's not without its critics, because it makes a lot of tension in this center, a lot of anxiety. They get 48 hours notice. 5 years ago, they used to get 6 weeks notice, and that didn't work. So now they have 48 hours notice, but everybody keeps their paperwork up to date in case they get inspected, and staff will say they spend more time on their paperwork and not enough with the children. So it's not ideal. Yeah.
That's what's causing this disruption.
Yeah, I want to pass it on to Nirmala.
Okay, well, our system of inspection is very much based on the UK system, but I thought I'll just give a concrete example of what happens. I also want to highlight some kind of trends that we follow. So we have moved towards centers evaluating themselves. So before what we call it school self-evaluation, we use a lot of jargon, but anyway, before the inspectors come, the schools are supposed to complete a questionnaire, okay? And they're supposed to get data from parents, important stakeholders, about their programs, and they have to prepare for this inspection, which is a very high-pressure event, okay? So the Hong Kong government uses carrots and sticks to drive its agenda, okay? And inspection is very, very important. So they come, they give you little notice, they stay there for 2 days, and they look at everything, okay? They just look at everything. They even look at children's work. You know, are they copying Chinese characters unnecessarily before they're 4 years old, et cetera, et cetera. And then this report is put up on the web, which is nice. They're rated on 4-point scale, but the rating is not put. But when you read the qualitative comments, you can figure out what the rating is. And you have to get an acceptable. If you don't get an acceptable, you're put on probation and you're inspected again within a year, okay? You could lose your license. So this is one aspect of data to drive improvement, okay? Because you're monitored. And what is nice about this system is it's accompanied by pedagogical support from these inspectors. These inspectors are experienced educators, so they're not only seeing whether you meet their standards, you know, for whatever health and the structural quality indicators, they're looking at the pedagogy. So they will say that it's supportive. They do give advice to teachers. So this is, again, important. This is improving the system.
This is pretty high-stakes stuff. How do you gain key stakeholder support for it?
It's a problem. We haven't solved it. People get quite anxious about it. Parents love it. And parents tell their elected representatives they want it. So I think we're going to continue to have it.
So it's driven by parent demand.
Governments, but parents like it.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, because they can choose. It's too high stakes because where all our early childhood services are in the private sector, so parents can decide where to send their kids. And because we value innovation, the market demands, if you've got a good school, I'm going to send my kid to your school and not to your school, you know. So parents are consumers. It's a market-driven strategy.
Yeah.
But the government controls drive improvement because parents do not always select what we think is the best.
Right. So I'm going to get Craig and Jacqueline into this in just a minute, but just one more follow-up on this. So do you often close or sanction programs? And when you do so in Hong Kong and UK, for what reasons do you do that?
Mostly for safety reasons, very occasionally for welfare, but mostly for safety reasons. If the pedagogy is inadequate, we try to improve them, and as Nirmala said, they get a chance, they get some support to improve their pedagogy.
I can't really recollect many programs that have closed, actually.
Yeah.
If they've closed, it's because of the falling birth rate and not being able to have enough people. It's just that I think the system of inspection is also quite supportive. Though they'll get a consultant to come and help them improve their pedagogy or something.
Yeah. Jacqueline, you've had really interesting background both as a national policymaker, as a standards and assessment research, scientist, as a philanthropist. What do you draw from these, country cases in terms of what we should be doing around data improvement and R&D to, really drive program improvement in the U.S.?
I think I would take a step back and think about why you look at assessment, what some principles of assessment might be. First of all, it seems to me you need to understand the construct to be assessed and the purpose of the assessment. And I worry that we're not on the same page about the construct to be assessed or the purpose of the assessment. And so we've got a lot of measures that do lots of things, and we use them in lots of different ways. I'm not at all sure we use them in ways that give us information about student progress, about policy decisions. And I just think we need to maybe take a little step back and think about, what do we need? What do we want to know? What is important? And then look at the systems we have in place. Because I do worry that we don't always use assessments in the ways in which they were designed. I think, what is it, Lynn, 1998, when we had the goals panel purposes of assessment, we did it then. We've had a National Academies report on early childhood assessment, and yet we still struggle with this distinction between child-level aggregated data for policy decisions and how we actually look at individual child outcomes to make decisions around instruction, practice, and communication with parents. I just think we need clarity around that, and I think that would be tremendously important. We have large data sets that the federal government has supported in some ways, and they're good. We need more. But I think we also need to think about why we need them, how we get them to talk to each other, and what is it we plan to do with these data. I was really struck by the use of formative assessments in the countries. And I think that is such an important way to look at student learning. And yet, when I think about formative assessments, really good ones, I think about the training it takes teachers to understand child development, to understand how to observe, how to document, how to translate that and communicate those results. That's not something that happens quickly. Those are skills that are learned over time and honed over time. And I worry that we don't pay enough attention to that. We've got lots of formative assessments that can quickly become checklists. And that's not the intent of those assessments. And I think for the research community, those assessments often lose their credibility because we don't believe that we can then aggregate them up and look at them because there's so much variability. So I think we have tools, but we have some real sort of stepping back and thinking to do about what is important in this world of early care and education. If you measure it, then it's important.
Yeah.
But we measure things and then we say that that wasn't really the important thing. So we've got to get some clarity, not federally, but nationally, around what is important, what needs to be understood. And then, Linda mentioned quality. And goodness, don't we all have definitions of quality? I've heard people say, how do you have quality if you don't have good child outcomes? How are they connected? What does that mean? And I think our quality measures don't really have really strong connections to child outcomes right now. And that's something we have to really, that's our inconvenient truth, if you will. We've got to really face that and deal with that and understand what is it we're really looking at.
Yeah. So Jacqueline, as you are wont to do, you've raised a whole set of really fundamental questions for us about purpose and application and execution. And luckily we have Craig here who's answering all these questions in Montgomery County. So Craig, what do you take away from the country cases? And tell us a little bit about how you are pioneering some really program improvement strategies using a rich mix of data and research.
Well, I'm certainly not feeling the pressure, that's for sure. It's one where I'm actually very honored to be on this panel, to be here, because it's one of the only elected officials who has the responsibility to not only think about these and work with folks who are brainstorming about ways to move us forward, but also in terms of actually making these things come to fruition and happen, both budgetarily as well as via policy, whether it's legislation or just straight policy itself. And it's one in which we in Montgomery County, and I chair our Education and Culture Committee, but I also serve as the Maryland Association of Counties chair for their Education Committee, and now am for the past 2.5 years have been on our Commission on Innovation and Excellence in Education for the state of Maryland, where we have realized that, just as Jacqueline said, and I'll pick up where she left off, we have not done a good job of data collection nor usage of that data. The reality is that all across the state of Maryland, currently what we have is a system in which we allow both sampling and census. And just that alone, in terms of understanding that a child who comes to school, who's hungry the day that they're getting an assessment, who's had a mom and dad who've been arguing the night before, is not going to perform at the same level as another because they're thinking about what happened the night before and not that. And so from a sheer data perspective, you lose so many of those, and you get all these different quirks that are not real when it comes to true data collection. And so from that perspective, as part of our recommendations, we've said, look, there's no more playing around when it comes to collection of data. It has to be a census. It has to be everyone, so that we can really start to identify what some of those trends are. But in addition, we also have to talk about the usage of that data and what it means. And we have to explain to our constituency, to our families, to our greater public, about the fact that we're not trying to label children, because that's always what folks initially who are resistant to data collection think, is that this is going to be designed to label my child in such a way as deficient or not performing, and therefore they're going to be placed in something different, and my child's going to get less than what another parent's child is going to get. And the reality is that the earlier that we can identify some of the learning challenges or learning delays that children have, some of the challenges that are befalling our children, the better we can be in terms of really giving them what they need. And it's very interesting. Just the other night, I was with our community support for autistic adults and children. And the woman who's been doing this work for 40 years said that now that she's focused on a lot of workforce development and a lot of just inclusion, wants to focus on early identification, and said that from an autistic perspective, science has said that they can now start identifying things as early as 14 months. And so her new quest is to really start making sure that from a developmental delay perspective, from some of the special needs that we see in our community, that we start to work on identifying some of this early. That can happen as a result of assessments. And so we have to remind folks that these assessments are not just about making sure that we can tweak our programs to make sure that they're delivering, but also in terms of giving us the ability to meet the needs of our students where they are. And that truly is what I think is the next step for us, what we see in other countries that are doing this better than we are.
Could I just come in? Thank you for that. When you made your comment, I think it's really important when we talk about data to drive improvement, we differentiate at the different levels. One, at the child level, to ensure that they get services. So like we have all sorts of systems, you know, the medical and the social welfare work together, whatever. Anyway, there's the other dimension of program evaluation that Kathy and I have been talking about, which Lynn was quite fascinated by, the inspection system. But there is another higher level of data to drive improvement, and that's data to determine system health and data to determine services needed. So all school systems, for example, they monitor the number of kids that are born that year, because that the number of teachers you need, what we call it manpower planning, you know, but basically we know we're going to have a lot of less secondary schools because of the fewer babies in that cohort. We know we're going to have more ethnic minorities, or we know we're going to have more special needs. So I think it's really important that we differentiate those kind of data. And what happens is governments, I don't know what happens in America, but I do know that our government collects a lot of data on system health. So for example, we do incredibly well on the PISA and TIMS and all that, not only in terms of performance, but in terms of very low socioeconomic gradient, because the quality of our public school education is so good that it doesn't matter. It actually gets rid of the what we call the achievement gap that you have in America that seems to increase.
You're depressing us.
I'm sorry, no. This is data on system health, okay? But what I'm saying is these data are collected, but they're not made public by government to us. You know, we know about all, for example, kids are assessed. We don't do it like England does, but we know our kids are assessed in primary one, but we're just not given the data. They say, oh, that's for system health, you know. So there are...
Who does get those data?
Only the government.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they use it for program planning and policy development.
So I just wanted to add one of the things, Michael, to that, and that's the reason why I think our recommendations from the Kerwin Commission are going to be so important, because, and we've already started doing this, as you alluded to, in Montgomery County, to where we now have data-driven dashboards. And so those are out there for public consumption to allow for us to analyze. So it's exactly, but this is new. And keep in mind, this is not consistent across all of the state of Maryland, nor definitely not nationally.
About which data you're sharing with whom, like what do you do? What are you sharing with parents, with programs, with communities?
Sure. So when it comes to some of the data surrounding performance, and also when it comes to what are the specifics around where children are, how many children have IEPs, what are the results of those children who have IEPs, and have they been able to progress? Have we been able to take children from non-performing levels, and of course we're not student-specific in terms of that data, but it is grouped per school, and so we can see where a school may be performing and taking children who were not on grade level and now all of a sudden are performing on grade level, and then start to analyze the particular programs that are in that particular school and say, well, why is it working at this school? And if this particular school doesn't have this type of programming, maybe we need to add that there to help accentuate what they're doing around wraparound services for that child. We have varied programs where we have a specific thing called linkages to learning, where we actually are primarily focused with our immigrant community in terms of English acquisition, as well as connections to healthcare, connections to mental health support, all of those things that involve a true community school. And we've seen in those particular areas, like South Lake Elementary School in Montgomery Village, Maryland, to where you've seen tremendous growth, and that equity gap, that opportunity achievement gap, start to become eroded. And so again, so we put that data out there so that we see and then can say and identify that another school that has that same sort of makeup, these are the kinds of things that we need to push into that school to get that same sort of level of achievement.
I'm going to come back to Jacqueline. So you raised a bunch of different questions about sort of purpose and alignment and coherence in your great initial comments. Let's talk about the role of the national government and philanthropy in thinking about creating more coherence, more aligned purpose here. What you've worn a few different hats. Give us your wisdom on this. Like, what should we be doing here in the U.S.?
And keep a job is my problem. I think the federal government has a really important role in kind of looking at cross-state performance. The states have responsibility for education. I've learned to say that up front. But I think that this notion of how we're doing as a country, these are important questions. Those are sort of the systems health of the country. Those are important questions. The NAEP data is really important. We have a lot of data sets so that the federal government can support the development of data sets. It can support all kinds of information gathering that we think is important to have us understand where we are as a country. States, on the other hand, are pretty much focused on where they are and what they're doing, and those are their resources. And that's right. But I think their job is to look a little deeper. And I think, how do you do this? Montgomery County says this is what we're going to do. I live in New Jersey. There are 600 school districts in New Jersey, and they're all doing what they want to do in some way of collecting data. They do what the state says. But I think we have this sort of larger federal role, an infusion of money, sort of incentivizing innovation, because innovation isn't going to happen in Washington, it'll only happen at the state and local level. But then I think philanthropy has this wonderful power of convening, being able to say, what are the issues here? And bringing people. It's amazing how many people come because you're a foundation and you invite them to come. But that is important, to take that step back that I mentioned and to start to think, what do we have? What do we need? How do we start to plan something that's better? So I think there's a philanthropic role for that, as well as a philanthropic role in creating the incentives to create innovation across the country.
So I want to talk about something that kind of roils the conversation here in the U.S., which is child outcomes. Could you give us some insight on how difficult it's been to establish appropriate, sensitive, program improvement, but lower stakes kinds of child outcomes data in your countries? And then I want to get into a conversation about that here in the U.S. too.
I'll try to be brief. At age 5, our children are not given tests. It's a profile, and it's a best fit judgment on a scale of, I think, 5. The child has far exceeded expectations in this area, is at expectations, is below, and is not even on the scale. So the profile, teachers make notes as they observe the children in their normal activities and play. There are, I think, 35 items, and it has pretty good reliability. Not brilliant, I mean, obviously it's teacher judgment, but when we use it to predict test scores which children take at the age of 11, it has quite a bit of predictive validity. So we then, in the United Kingdom, in all of the countries of the United Kingdom, we do test at age 11, which is when children leave primary school and go into secondary school, and that's a 3-hour test on literacy, numeracy, and science.
Similar approach to child health outcomes, or is that a different standard?
We also have child health outcomes. Children have the developmental check when they're 2. It's done by a trained nurse or a health visitor. And it's to identify, as Nirmala said, it's to identify children who might have needs, but it's not just health. It asks questions about learning also.
Yes.
And it's to put in place support.
In Hong Kong, when they evaluate programs, the domain that's looked at is children's learning. So all kindergartens are evaluating children's learning in some way, but not in a standardized way. They all have some kind of checklist. I think a lot of them use portfolios, observations of children. They have to send reports to parents. So this is communicated. But in terms of the standardized way, I think we have, through our maternal and child health, every child at 2, 4, 6, they do the screening. But at primary 1, each child in a public school completes a test in Chinese, English, and mathematics. But that is only kept by the education department. And children also have standardized tests at primary 3, that's grade 3 and 5. But these are not, it's like your Iowa test or something. It's not given, the results are not given to the children. What is given to the school is the average results. So the government is able to track a child from primary 1 to grade 12 when they do the public exam, but these are not shared. This is available, but only for the government, yeah.
Because we're running a little bit late from the break, we have like 2.5 minutes left. Craig, really quickly, what are you doing around child outcomes? And then I'm going to have a closing question.
So just very quickly, and we've written this into the Kerwin Commission recommendations, that we want to make sure that we create, because we are going to have to create this, an assessment tool, and it's key that it's an assessment, not a test, that gives teachers the ability to lesson plan around where their classroom is, as well as identify where individual students' needs may not be met by the standardized curriculum that they have before them. And that's specifically written into our recommendations, something that I think is going to be incredibly important, but is going to be a challenge because we will still have people who will resist the fact that when we say assessments, they're automatically thinking we're sitting down a child and having them fill out bubbles on a Scantron sheet. And it will be an education process about really educating our greater state about what this assessment means, and more importantly, how that data is going to be utilized to make sure we're providing the best sort of situation for those individual children.
Great. Okay. Final question. Imagine this fall, Jacqueline Jones and Rebecca Gomez have decided to announce a major new fund that is going to be a cross-national fund around data improvement to drive, data and research improvements to drive program improvements across the world. What are your highest priorities in 30 seconds each for informing the evolution and implementation of that fund? Kathy.
I would really get a very, very good assessment of the program itself, because I think that that's the engine room of the child's development, is their daily context.
Okay, so you would fund that.
I would first have a call for proposals to get the best ideas in the world.
Good idea. All right, that's it. Great.
I look at what Finland and Hong Kong and others are doing. Look, it really boils down to an assessment tool that's not cumbersome, that allows teachers to lesson plan around identifying students that need additional assistance, making sure that we can provide comprehensive support in the classroom for children on an individualized basis.
Jacqueline, what should you be funding in this area?
Well, I think I would like to fund this notion of comprehensive assessment systems, so that we're not thinking about a formative assessment or a summative assessment or a screening measure, but we're looking at the totality of ways in which we can gather information about individual students as well as groups of students. And we don't do that. So I think we're looking at that. The other thing I really want to speak to is this notion of context that Lynn brought up so lovely, in such a lovely way in this book. And for me, when I think about the context, I think about different research questions, because I don't think we've thought about context as we do our randomized controlled trials. They're great, they're wonderful. They give us this notion of causal inferences, but it's the mean differences between two groups without any explanation as to why that happened. And so I think about context and think we need to ask different questions. We need to ask not, does the program work? Because if it does, then we've got to replicate the whole thing someplace else. But what components of this program are working for which children under what conditions? And I think if we can get to comprehensive assessment systems, get to this notion of looking at the implementation of programs and a broader question, I think we'd be in a better place for using those data in a way that's useful.
We will let those wise words and the wise advice and counsel of our other colleagues here close that panel. Thank you very much.